This, of course, came as a huge shock, and William and I have been doing everything we can to process and manage this privately for the sake of our young family.
It came as a shock to almost everyone who watched it, and by the next morning, the Crown Princess and her husband had already asked their household not to comment further, hoping the family could process what had happened somewhere quiet. But Lady Josephine Renata had spent years doing exactly what the House of Aldemar seemed to expect of her, standing at the edge of photographs, asking for nothing and accepting that other names would always be read before hers. Then, in a recorded conversation cleared for broadcast, she stopped accepting it. Her words were not loud. They were worse for the palace because they were calm. Elena fought for me when the crown wanted me forgotten. In a single sentence, Josephine turned a private act of loyalty into a public reckoning. Josephine made the statement almost by accident, tucked into the final minutes of an interview meant to promote a children's literacy charity she had quietly supported for 6 years. She explained that palace planners had approved a proposal to remove her from several commemorations built around the memory of her grandmother, the late Queen Adelheid. These were not grand royal duties. They were small, almost sentimental gatherings, a memorial garden opening, an annual reading of Adelheid's old letters, a modest wreath laying at the Queen's favorite chapel. But for Josephine, they were the last threads connecting her to a grandmother she had adored, and someone had decided, quietly and administratively, that those threads no longer needed to include her. Crown Princess Elena had seen the proposal before it became final, and she had intervened. Josephine had never been known for confrontation. She had spent nearly a decade in the shadow of the Aldemar throne, the daughter of Prince Julian and Princess Marielle, close enough to royal life to understand its rhythms, far enough from the line of succession to know how easily she could be moved out of frame. She had learned early that dignity in her family often meant standing 3 steps back and saying nothing about it. Just before the interview, she had sat beside her mother with her prepared notes open on her lap. Her finger had stopped at the paragraph naming Elena. Marielle had offered, gently, to cut it. Josephine had closed the folder instead. "No," she said. "She deserves the truth." Elena received a transcript of the interview that evening. She read the sentence about herself twice, set the page down, and said nothing for a long moment. Her husband, Crown Prince Alexander, watched the shift in her face and understood immediately what it meant. Elena had never wanted her intervention to become public. She had defended Josephine privately because she believed the girl was being pushed to the margins through a process built to look harmless, a line removed from a guest list here, a seat reassigned there. Nothing dramatic enough to draw questions, until one day, Josephine simply wasn't in the room anymore, and no one remembered exactly when that had started. To understand why Elena had noticed what almost everyone else allowed to continue, the story has to move backward, away from the sentence that startled the country, and toward the years Josephine spent learning how quietly a royal life could be erased. Josephine was never raised to expect a spotlight. If anything, she was raised to distrust one. Her mother had come into the family from outside its oldest bloodlines, and Marielle had always sensed correctly that her daughter's place in the family's affections would need to be earned through usefulness and modesty rather than assumed through birthright. Josephine absorbed that lesson early. She learned to watch ceremonies from the edge. She learned to let louder, more central royal stories pass in front of her without complaint. There is a difference, though, between choosing a quiet life and discovering that other people have quietly chosen one for you. And Elena understood that difference long before Josephine was willing to say it out loud. The two women had grown close in ways that rarely made it into official photographs. Josephine listened before she spoke. She carried her responsibilities without turning them into performances. Their bond had formed in the in-between moments, a private word after a long family funeral, an encouraging note passed along after a difficult public appearance, the kind of understanding that doesn't need constant explaining. Elena respected that restraint in her young sister-in-law, but she had also begun to notice its cost. Josephine could absorb disappointment so gracefully that people mistook her silence for consent. Marielle saw it more plainly one evening after a family gathering, when Josephine came home and unpinned a ceremonial sash from her coat after being told, almost as an afterthought, that she wouldn't be needed at the next royal function. Josephine had laughed it off, saying it was probably simpler this way. Marielle hadn't laughed. She had watched her daughter fold the sash with careful, practiced hands, and she realized Josephine had begun treating her own exclusion as something to be accepted politely, the way one accepts a change in the weather. Prince Julian struggled with the same problem from a different angle. In a private conversation with his wife, he admitted that defending Josephine too forcefully might be read by the household as ambition, as though a father's protectiveness could be mistaken for a bid to push his daughter closer to the throne. He had spent years making sure nothing about his branch of the family looked like it wanted more than it had been given. Marielle told him that protecting a child from humiliation was not the same as demanding promotion for her. He knew she was right. The tension stayed anyway. Elena, meanwhile, had already begun to notice a pattern in the paperwork. Josephine's name would appear on early drafts of commemorative schedules and disappear from the final versions. It happened often enough that Elena started keeping her own copies, comparing drafts side by side. Eventually, she laid two versions of the same schedule in front of Alexander. Josephine's name was on the first page and missing from the second. Alexander studied both, circled the gap with his pen, and asked only one question: who changed this? Months before Josephine ever said Elena's name aloud in public, one missing line on one internal schedule had already told her exactly what the palace machinery was quietly prepared to do. The turning point didn't begin with a confrontation. It began with a seating chart. During preparations for a private memorial gathering honoring Queen Adelheid, Elena noticed that Josephine's name had been dropped from the family procession order and her seat moved back, away from the immediate family section. To anyone glancing at the paperwork, it looked like routine administration. To Elena, it looked deliberate. Josephine arrived expecting the place she'd always occupied at these gatherings, not a grand one, but a real one, close enough to the front to feel like family rather than an afterthought. An aide met her instead and explained, gently and without apology, that the arrangements had changed. She would enter separately. Her seat had moved. Josephine felt the sting immediately and did what she had always done with it. She absorbed it. She folded the revised program, thanked the aide, and started toward her new position without a word of protest. Elena saw the whole exchange from across the room. She had already noticed the vanishing names on the schedules. Now, she was watching the pattern happen in real time. And this time, Josephine couldn't hide the hurt quickly enough to keep Alana from seeing it. Alana followed her into a quiet corridor and asked directly whether Josephine had agreed to the change. Josephine gave the answer that had protected everyone but herself for years. It doesn't matter. Alana told her that it clearly did. Josephine finally admitted she'd been told the smaller role would be better for the shape of the ceremony. The phrase sounded harmless. Its meaning wasn't. Someone had decided that Josephine's presence made the family look less streamlined. Elena went back to the organizers herself. She asked, without raising her voice, who had authorized the change. An official explained it reflected new priorities around presentation and effort to keep the public-facing family smaller and easier for cameras to frame. Elena rejected the logic outright. Josephine wasn't competing for prominence. She was honoring her grandmother. When an advisor warned that reversing the decision might set a precedent, Elena answered without hesitation that treating a granddaughter as disposable would set a far worse one. Before the ceremony began, she took Josephine's original place card and returned it to its position herself. Josephine never forgot that gesture. Neither did the officials who watched her do it. The restored seat should have settled the matter. Instead, it opened a quieter, more dangerous argument inside the palace over who actually had the authority to decide which family members still mattered. Months later, a new proposal arrived, one that would have limited Josephine's role at future commemorations even further, permitting her to appear only when accompanying her parents, effectively ending her standing as an individual presence at events tied to her own grandmother's memory. This time, Elena didn't send a message through intermediaries. She asked for the decision to be defended to her directly. She sat across from two senior advisors with no junior staff present, a folder between them. She asked, evenly, Why a young woman who had met every expectation placed on her was suddenly being treated as a problem to be managed. One advisor used the phrase clearer visual hierarchy, a smaller, easier to explain group of senior royals for public consumption. Elena set down her pen. She asked whether family members were now being measured by how well they photographed. The advisors insisted the proposal was about clarity, not punishment. Alana didn't accept the distinction. Josephine had never sought attention, never competed for status, never embarrassed the family, and somehow that very quietness had made her easy to remove. Elena invoked the late Queen Adelheid directly, reminding the room that Adelheid had deliberately kept Josephine connected to family life without pressuring her into full duty, a balance that had protected both the girl and the institution. Cutting her out now wouldn't modernize that arrangement, it would erase it. When the advisors still refused to withdraw the proposal, Elena made the stakes plain. She would take the matter to King Frederick himself, and, if necessary, she would put her objection in writing so no one could later claim her position had been unclear. At that point, Josephine's situation stopped being an administrative footnote. It became a decision the king would have to own personally. King Frederick read the file alone before a scheduled family meeting. The recommendation had come from the office responsible for ceremonial planning, and its logic was simple on paper. Fewer working royals meant less public confusion. Elena had already rejected that reasoning outright. Efficiency, she argued, could not become a polite word for making a loyal relative disappear. Frederick reached the page containing Elena's written objection and stopped reading. He set his glasses down beside the folder and sat with Josephine's name for a long moment. He understood the danger clearly enough. Approving the proposal wouldn't just simplify a schedule. It would tell his brother's family that their daughter could be quietly reduced precisely because she was too well-mannered to fight back, and it would confirm, in policy, everything Elena feared the earlier seating incident had already hinted at. Prince Julian met his brother privately and didn't soften his words. He said he had never asked for a grand public role for his daughter and had no intention of starting now, but he would not accept her being humiliated because everyone assumed her good manners meant she wouldn't object. Frederick listened. Julian repeated that this was never about rank. It was about whether loyalty counted for anything when it came from someone standing outside the direct line of succession. Alexander reinforced his wife's case, telling the king that Elena's intervention hadn't been impulsive. She had kept records, scheduled drafts, where Josephine appeared, and then quietly vanished, gathered over more than a year. A single incident could be dismissed as logistics. A pattern was harder to explain away. Frederick ultimately refused to approve the blanket restriction. He ordered that Josephine's future participation be assessed individually, occasion by occasion, rather than filtered out automatically by a formula based on distance from the throne. The immediate threat passed. The underlying attitude behind it did not. Josephine, for a long time, only knew about the seating incident. She had no idea about the schedules Elena had kept, the written objection, the confrontation with the advisors, or the conversation that had reached the king. Marielle had shielded her from those details, afraid they would make her daughter feel like a burden rather than a person worth defending. When the fuller story finally came out, Josephine didn't feel embarrassed. She felt something sharper. Marielle sat with her one evening and walked through all of it, the altered schedules, Elena's questions, the confrontation with the officials, the written objection that had gone all the way to Frederick. Josephine listened without interrupting. The longer her mother spoke, the more the story rearranged itself in her mind. Elena hadn't simply corrected one seating chart on one difficult afternoon. She had been watching for a long time, noticing a pattern Josephine herself had been trying hard not to see, and pushing back against it every time the palace tried to make the problem look smaller than it was. "Why didn't she tell me?" Josephine finally asked. Marielle answered simply, because she wasn't doing it to be thanked. Gratitude came first. Then something harder to sit with the realization of how completely Josephine had accepted the idea that being overlooked was simply the price of being who she was. She had trained herself to believe that questioning it would look ungrateful, that disappointment should be swallowed quietly, and that dignity meant making every slight easier for everyone but herself. Marielle told her one more thing. Elena had specifically asked that most of this stay private. because she didn't want Josephine to feel indebted or pressured into taking on a bigger public role she hadn't chosen for herself. That detail changed everything for Josephine. Elena hadn't been fighting to make her more visible. She had been fighting for her right to choose her own visibility without being pushed to the margins in the meantime. That night, Josephine opened the remarks she'd prepared for the literacy charity interview, cut several safe, careful paragraphs, and wrote one sentence in their place: "Elena fought for me when the crown wanted me forgotten." Before the interview aired, Josephine asked for one private conversation with Elena, no advisors, no prepared language, just the two of them. She said plainly that she intended to talk about what had happened, because people who only saw royal appearances from the outside rarely understood what quiet exclusion actually felt like from within a family. They saw who attended and who was mentioned. They almost never saw the slow damage of being repeatedly, politely left out. Alana's discomfort was immediate. She asked Josephine not to turn her into the hero of the story. Josephine refused to back down this time. She said her place in the family should never have depended on someone stepping in to rescue it in the first place, and that Elena hadn't given her that place. She had defended one that already belonged to her. That distinction, Josephine said, was the whole point. Elena fell quiet, visibly moved. Josephine admitted something she'd never said aloud before. After the seating incident, she had seriously considered withdrawing from future family occasions entirely, on her own terms, rather than wait to be quietly removed again. Elena reached across the table and told her, simply, never to make herself smaller, just to make someone else's decision easier. When the interview aired, the reaction wasn't what the palace expected. Attention didn't settle on Elena. It settled on Josephine on every quiet appearance, every place at the edge of a photograph, every ceremony where she had stood without asking to be noticed. Her statement hadn't revealed a scandal. It had revealed something more ordinary and more uncomfortable. How easily an institution can overlook someone who never complains, and how much it costs that person to finally say she noticed. Marielle stayed close as coverage grew, less worried about the headlines themselves than about whether Josephine would regret exposing something so private once the attention arrived in full. Josephine told her the only regret was waiting so long to say it. The royal household eventually announced that future commemorative appearances tied to Queen Adelaide's memory would be assessed individually going forward, rather than trimmed automatically, based on a family member's distance from the throne. At the next family gathering, nobody had to fight to put Josephine's name back on the list. It was already there. She walked in beside Elena, and the message needed no further explanation. She hadn't been promoted. She had simply, finally, been remembered not as a footnote rescued by a future queen, but as a young woman who had learned at some cost that her own quiet loyalty was never the same thing as her own erasure.